fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of the Versus Stars podcast, third season. And my loyal listeners, thank you for helping me on my quest to 1,000 subscribers. It's an amazing episode because Tom DeFalco boards the mothership. We discuss his amazing career in comics. Now come aboard as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. DeFalco. Thanks so much for the Versus Stars podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, Jeff.
It's a ton of honor of mine. So I always start off with a question of inspiration to inspire your love for comics and who your earliest influences.
Well, my earliest influences were comic strips. The standard ones: the Phantom, Mandrake the Magician, Leonard Starr on Stage, Dick Tracy. My favorite comic strip, which took me a while to get into, but once I did, I was hooked. Was Walt Kelly's Pogo. Those characters, just most of the time I couldn't understand what they were saying or what they were talking about, but they just hooked me.
I'm not sure I know that one. Which one? What is that one?
Walt Kelly's Pogo. It's a classic. I mean, come on.
No, I must admit, when Sunday paper when I was a kid, we had Spider-Man, we had a few other like Peanuts families like that, but that was not one of them.
Well, I just feel sorry for you. Walt Kelly, to my generation, is what Calvin and Hobbes is for most, maybe for your generation.
Okay.
I think Fantagraphics is reprinting the Walt Kelly material. So, check out your local library. All right.
So when did you transition into the comic books as we understand them?
Comic books as we understand them. A cousin of mine, one time at some family gathering, handed me a comic book. First time I had ever seen one of those things. And it had this very scary character in it called the Batman. I don't know if he ever amounted to much, but I just remember that character scared the heck out of me. But I really liked the format, that the idea that there were complete stories in this, magazine, which went for a dime at that stage. And then, to my amazement, I found out that you could get comic books at my local candy store. And from then on, I was just kind of hooked. And I read every kind of comic book.
I think that's one of the great things about comic books of the past is that they were far more accessible. In other words, you could get them almost anywhere versus having to go to a particular comic book stores or now online. I will say where I live now, there's not even a comic book store really in the city anymore. So they're not accessible as they used to be.
And that's a terrible shame. Because, comic books were great. When you're 10 years old, there's nothing like a Superman comic book or a Casper the Friendly Ghost comic book or fill in the blank. They were terrific. In my day, a bunch of the kids would show up and we'd sit on somebody's stoop and, we'd all show up with a handful of comic books and then just pass them around and, spend a nice Saturday reading comic books. And, this is before collectors or conditions. You knew that if you showed up with 5 comic books, you went home with 5 comic books. They may not be the same 5 comic books, probably weren't, but the numbers stayed even.
And I mean, from that humble beginning, you became one of the greats in the comic book industry. I mean, I must admit, when I was thinking about which comic books I want to talk to you about, there was a lot I had to consider and a lot I had to take out. So these are kind of like had to hit the highlights. You've done so many famous ones, but what I actually read before, I don't know if it was before you got into comic books, or early on, that you were really important to G.I. Joe's, that we understand it too, which is kind of cool because I'm a G.I. Joe fan from back in the day of the toy collection. So I heard that you helped to develop some of the G.I. Joe profiles of the characters we understand now.
Well, I worked with the creative team that put, the G.I. Joe, comics and the, rebooted G.I. Joe in the 80s. All right, let's say that. But 99.99% percent of that was done by Larry Hama.
Hmm.
I mean, he was the writer. I just got to sit back and look at what all the brilliance of Larry Hama, who is probably one of the most unrelated. He is one of the greatest talents out there. When you talk about the greats, you got to mention Larry Hama. I'm not even in the same class with him. Let me let me tell you. Um, don't tell him I said nice things about him. Okay.
So, for those who don't know, back in the day, GI Joe toys, the figures themselves came out with those little profiles on the back. Tell me who the character was. So I heard that you worked on those, some of those.
Well, yeah, like I said, Larry wrote all of that stuff. I just basically edited them, which isn't doing too much when you're dealing with a brilliant writer like Larry Hama.
No, I mean honestly, Larry Hamill was fantastic, and I did invite him to the show a few times, though he didn't say yes. But either way, he was invited to the show. When did you know early on that even with looking at the comic books and what the toys were going to look like, that these were going to become one of the most important toy lines of an entire generation?
I I don't know. At the time we were doing it, we were just trying to do we were focused on the comic book, and we were trying to do the best comic book we could do, and that's what we were focused on. We were hoping the toy line would succeed, because we liked working with the guys from Hasbro. They were all total professionals. They were great guys to work with. But we had no idea if the toy line was going to work or anything. You're just trying to do the best stories, the best artwork. I will tell you a funny story. When Herb Trimpe, who drew the first issue, when he started working on him, to give Herb the right reference, they sent down a lot of the prototypes of the toys.
Mm-hmm.
And we gave them to Herb. And Herb, in the first story, there's this thing called Cobra Island. Herb built a model of Cobra Island so that he knew where everything was.
Well, that's cool.
So that he would make sure that when he was drawing scenes, he knew exactly how to place the characters and that sort of thing.
Oh, that's cool.
When he finished the first issue, he came in and he said to me, "How involved are you guys with this toy company?" I said, I don't know, kind of involved. I said, because these toys, I don't know if they're going to work. I said, why, Herb? It's just because, they're very cheaply put together. They were falling apart. I said, Herb, you had prototypes that were made. The ones that you have are made out of clay. They're not the actual toys. He goes, oh, okay. He says, yeah, well, he felt bad about the fact that some of the toys, the arms had fallen off and that sort of stuff, as he was, maneuvering them around. And he said, well, to make it up for the guys, I'm going to give them the island. So, we gave the Hasbro people Herb's Cobra Island. I don't know whatever happened to that.
Like I said, I mean, I love those toys. When growing up, there's a lot of Christmases and Hanukkahs that were filled with getting GI Joe figures, so they were just extremely important to me.
They were a great set of toys. I remember they gave me a complete set, including the army tank, which I gave to one of my nephews who blew it up at a certain point.
Oh.
And still moans about the fact that he said, I should have kept them all in their packages. They'd be worth a fortune now. But who knew? They were toys. You're supposed to play with toys.
Like I said, as an adult, I've gone back and bought a few of the ones that I had as a kid again, and they're not cheap anymore, like $15-20. They're not even in packages anymore. They're worth a fortune if you had kept them in mint.
It's better that you played with them.
That part's true. And I think one of the great things about the characters of G.I. Joe is that they all seemed unique. You basically had like 40, 50, almost 100 G.I. Joe characters by the end, where each character still felt like a real individual character. And that must have been quite a challenge for you guys.
That was all Larry. I disappeared from GI Joe after the first, I was going to say year and a half or something, because I ended up working on other toy lines, other comic books, other things at Marvel. But over the years, Larry just kept on chugging on those things. I mean, he did a fabulous job, and he's still doing a fabulous job. He's still writing the GI Joe comic book.
Yeah. Well, I also read too that not only did you work on GI Joe, but you were part of the creative team that worked on the original Transformers too.
A little bit with the Transformers, not as much as GI Joe. The Transformers, I don't know if you know, was based on a Japanese line.
Yep.
And at one point, Hasbro came in, wanted us to deal with the Transformers, and they wanted to, we had to sign all these non-disclosure agreements and all that other stuff. And then they brought out the toys. And when they brought out the first couple of toys, I remember looking across the table at Larry. And the two of us kind of stood up and said, "Excuse us for a minute." We walked out, and we came back, and then we put the Japanese toys on the thing. They looked and said, "Wait a minute, where'd you get those things?" We bought them at Forbidden Planet, And they would say, "Well, that's a violation of your non-disclosure." No, it isn't. They're for sale down the block. Go get them.
That is fantastic. So, was this before or after you broke into the comic book world?
I was in the comic book world, long before I dealt with the GI Joe and Hasbro and that sort of stuff. I started it at Archie Comics in 1972. It's now 51 years. No, I'm starting my 52nd year in the comic book industry.
So you've had a good run, is what you're trying to say.
Yeah, I'm kind of useless in everything else. So
now, for those who also don't know, is that a lot of your famous runs had to do with Spider-Man. You've written some of the premier Spider-Man comic books in history. I mean, obviously, Stan Lee did his great run. You wrote Amazing Spider-Man 252, which is the very first black costume Spider-Man, which led to the eventual character Venom. So, which is an amazing issue right there. So, do you remember writing that issue back in the day, coming out of around Secret Wars?
Yeah, that was plotted by a gentleman called Roger Stern, who I thought was one of the top Spider-Man writers of all time. And Roger had decided to leave Spider-Man around that time, and go work on the Avengers. Now, in hindsight, we look back and we say, 252, the black costume. This was a momentous occasion. This was a big thing. Around that time, everybody thought this thing was going to be a big bomb. We got sacks of mail from irate readers who heard that there was a rumor that we were going to change Spider-Man costume, and all of them swearing they would never buy another Marvel comic book, never buy another Spider-Man comic book. This thing was considered a disaster before it came out. After it came out, we got the same amount of mail. In those days, you actually got physical letters. Same amount of mail saying how much they loved it. Comic book fans are a cowardly and superstitious lot. And
they never change, have they?
Things have not changed. They hate everything before they see it.
Yeah.
I'm often amazed when I find out that a movie is about to come out and there are all these horrible reviews about the movie, which hasn't been seen yet.
Yes, so
I always figure, you should see it first to decide whether or not you like it or dislike it. But that's an old-fashioned attitude, an old-fashioned idea.
So when you obviously there was the famous event comic book that eventually it turned out that your Amazing Spider-Man 252 actually was the first black costume, not the one people usually consider from the Secret War series. So when you were writing the black costume off Roger Stern's script, did you know the eventual fate that costume was going to have? Was it already planned so it had to become Venom and go in that direction, or was it something that you thought was going to stay as this kind of weird alien costume?
Um, well, when I was doing it, uh, I remember looking at the plot and saying, "Oh, this costume has all sorts of new powers." So I went to the editor in chief and I said, "Hey, this costume has all sorts of different powers and different abilities. How does that work?" And he looked at me and glared and he says, "Well, you're the writer. Come up with something." Um, and I around that time I don't serendipity. I happened to be reading something about whales and parasites and stuff like that and symbiotes, and I thought, it's an alien symbiote. And I remember saying that and explaining that to the artist Ron Friends, my unindicted co-conspirator, um, and we figured out how it all worked, and we basically figured out, how our story was going to, run, um, and how Spider-Man would eventually learn that it was a symbiote and then freak out, to get it off me, um, and then we figured this would be, a new thing in the Spider-Man universe. Venom was actually, I always say it was the creation of Dave Michelinie. Um, Dave just figured out, wait a minute, we have this alien symbiote that gives this guy, can give somebody the powers of Spider-Man. What if we turned it into a villain, and what if we combined it with, Eddie Brock and and the whole thing. That was all David Michelinie. Todd McFarlane was the artist who was assigned to draw it, and Todd, David, I remember, you know, uh, detailed, wrote in detail what Venom was supposed to look like, and Todd basically, followed David's instructions. For we now refer to Todd as the co-creator, but he came in later.
So, but like I said, having predated that, um, what were the conversations like about the impact of the costume on? You said did you? Because eventually the idea was that it was going to mess with Peter Parker as a character before he got rid of it.
Right.
At early, how early on did that was that a decision as well? And was there a point where there was like discussion of whether or not that was going to be a permanent change to the character, the black costume?
No, no. Well, because we got so much hate mail in the beginning, I remember at one point Jim Shooter came in and said, "When does Spider-Man get the new costume?" I said, "252." He says, "Get rid of it in 253."
Oh shit!
Everybody was afraid that this was going to destroy the sales of Spider-Man. And I remember saying, "Jim, he doesn't even get it in Secret Wars for another 8 issues. We got to at least wait until he gets it in Secret Wars before we get rid of it." And we had a long discussion about it. And Jim, I remember Jim saying to me, "Listen, if sales on Spider-Man go down because of this, it's going to be your butt." And I was thinking at the time, well, listen, I'm only the fill-in writer anyway. I'm not going to be. I'm going to get fired off anyway because I'm not good enough to do Spider-Man. I thought I was only going to be there for a couple of issues. So I figured, all right, we'll go with it. Now, once Ron and I realized it was an alien symbiote, we kind of worked out, the basic storyline because I'm a basic coward. I don't like to really start a story until I know how it ends. If you're doing some sort of mystery, you can find yourself in a bad hole if you don't know how it's supposed to end. So Ron and I worked everything out, and I got to give Ron, 50% of the credit. Probably all the good ideas that you like came from Ron, and I came up with all the bad ideas. But
But my understanding too, because 252 is credited with being the first black costume, though technically it comes from Secret Wars. how much of the storyline of Secret Wars did you know before you wrote 252, which is kind of supposed to come out after the storyline, where though technically it came out before it?
Um, I was editing Secret Wars, so I kind of knew the general storyline there. I didn't know all the details, but I knew the general storyline, so I knew where we were going.
So when you first saw what the costume was going to look like, how good did you think it was? Like, did you think to yourself, this actually people are going to be excited when they finally see what it comes out after all the fear, or what do you think to yourself, oh shit?
No, I thought it was an interesting design. I, you know, I wasn't, looking at it like a fan or anything. I thought, all right, we're gonna try something new. I I've always had the attitude that when you're working on a comic book, it's your job to create new things.
Hmm.
You're supposed to be adding to the universe. Um, some guys get on and they kill off this character, they kill off that character, and I think, don't subtract from the universe, add to the universe.
Hmm.
Create new characters, create new stuff, new concepts, new villains, and that's always been my attitude. And you try a bunch of things, and if they work, they work, and if they don't work, I say try something else.
And I must admit, the artists must have loved the new costume because the original Spider-Man you have to draw all those little webs everywhere. The new one, black, much easier on the artists.
No. Actually, Ron Friends was very disappointed because he had waited his whole life to draw Spider-Man, and then when he got the designs for the black costume, he first thought it was a villain. And then when he found out this was going to be Spider-Man's costume, he just felt kind of cheated. Um, and then as we discussed it, we realized that we're writing. Our attitude is we were writing the adventures of Pete Parker. Pete Parker, who sometimes put on a costume and called himself Spider-Man. So ultimately, it didn't matter, what the costume looked like. It was the adventures of Pete Parker, which is kind of the reverse of Captain America. Who Captain America is always Captain America, and occasionally he takes off the costume and pretends to be Steve Rogers.
And I think another great thing about that issue of 252 too is that once Spider-Man comes back to New York City, there's that beautiful scenes towards the end where he's swinging with those other characters and he's trying to show them how wonderful the city actually is. You just stop and enjoy and all that. And I think it was some great writing. I think you did with that issue. I think it was fantastic.
Well, thank you very much.
And you also happen to write now. One of my favorite storylines of all time in comic books is Maximum Carnage. I absolutely love the storyline. It got me into Spider-Man. I bought Spider-Man for years because of that storyline, and Carnage was one of my favorite characters. I bought so much Carnage. Anything he appeared, I ended up buying Carnage. But you wrote the bookends of Spider-Man Unlimited to that storyline. So you were the first one to, start off that big storyline. So how did you get involved with the Maximum Carnage story?
Well, I got conned. My editor, Danny Fingeroth, came in and said, hey, we're going to be doing a new Spider-Man book called Spider-Man Unlimited. And I was the editor-in-chief at the time. I said, yeah, I know, Danny. I approved it. And he said, it's only going to come out, 4 times a year. I said, yeah, I know exactly what it's supposed to do. I said, how'd you like to write it? I said, Danny, I got so much work to do. I don't have time to write another comic book. He says, but it's just like four extra stories, a year, just 4 stories. It's not going to take you a lot of time. You love the character, just 4 little stories a year. He says, you can do 4 stories a year, can't you? And I'm thinking, I get to sleep 5 or 6 hours a night, and I'm very attached to those 5 or 6 hours. Can I cut it down to 5.5? 5.5 to 4.5 hours a night? I don't know. And I said to Danny, Danny had conned me on so many things. Danny was also the editor on 252. He convinced me to take Spider-Man the first time. And I said, okay, Danny, let's try it out. I'll do it because it's just 4 simple stories. And of course, the first one has to be my Maximum Carnage. I was ready to kill him right then and there.
So when obviously when you write something Maximum Carnage, you're not you're writing with a series of other writers because it covered Web of Spider-Man, Spectacular Spider-Man, Spider-Man. It covered Amazing Spider-Man, then obviously Spider-Man Unlimited. So what was the conversations like among you guys on what this was going to look like?
We basically we would gather together. It was like once a month and have these all day discussions, plotting out the books and what was going to happen here and what was going to happen there, and what was going to be the cliffhanger of this issue, what was going to be the cliffhanger of that issue, and just working together. And I have to say that working in that group with that group of people, Howard Mackey and Mark DeMattis and Todd DeZago, Terry Kavanaugh, um, it was just, you know, such a wonderful group of people that we all had just, I can't say we all, I speak for myself. I had such a wonderful time, spending, whatever couple of days I spent with those guys working everything out. That was the real joy of comics for me. I always think comics is a team sport, and we had, one great team together.
Now, as the story starts off in Spider-Man Unlimited, you get Spider-Man, we get Carnage, we get Shriek, and then we get the Spider Doppelganger. Um, by the end of it, you have Demo Goblin, you have Carrion, you have I think Captain America shows up, Venom shows up. How big did you know it was going to get before you started writing that first issue?
Well, like I said, we were plotting this thing out, so we knew from the start that it was just going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, because that's what stories do.
Yeah.
They start small and they get bigger and bigger, and it's like a snowball that starts rolling down a mountain, and pretty soon is as big as a house. You just keep building to an exciting climax.
Now, another thing interesting is that once again, talking about the character Cletus Cassidy, who also showed up in the original Spider-Man 361 and 363, was his first major appearance. This is his second major appearance that he had. Now, a lot of people, I think, confuse Cassidy with the Joker. In other words, a serial killer, kind of psycho guy. And they think, well, he's kind of like Spider-Man's Joker, but he's very much different. As far as he actually builds a family around him in Maximum Carnage. He has a girlfriend, unlike Harley Quinn, a girlfriend that he actually seems to care about. So, what is it you think about Cletus Cassidy? That thing made him such a rich villain to play with?
Well, yeah. To be honest, I never even thought of a comparison between Cassidy and the Joker, because the Joker is a criminal mastermind who, I always thought, is not really crazy. Cassidy, he's a psychopath. He's just a psychopath. He's not anything else. And he just works off of instinct, where the Joker plans things out and everything. I think that having a character which had no limits, no filter, was something we had never seen before in comics. And I give again credit to David Michelin, who came up with it. This time working with Mark Bagley, who designed the characters. But I thought he was a very original character, because we've never seen a character totally without filters before. In some regards, as time went on, maybe the Joker took on aspects of Cletus, but Cletus was not the Joker.
I think one of the interesting thing is that you had to write this serial killer, and this very violent storyline. I mean, Carnage kills a lot of people in Maximum Carnage, but you had to do this all within the comics code. How hard is it to write a mass murdering psychopathic alien within the limits of a comics code?
I never thought of the comics code as being all that limiting. I think that we are creative people, and we could write any story Yeah, any story I wanted to write, I could write within the boundaries of the comics code. Um, I, you know, I know certain people hate the code and hated everything it stood for and all that other stuff. Um, I thought it just, kept people within the, within the bounds of good taste. And again, like I said, you could write any kind of story. Um, stories about discrimination, stories about religion, stories about, you know, murder, mass murder, that sort of stuff. And you could all, if you were a little bit creative, which is what they pay us to be, uh, you could do anything.
Now, as I mentioned, one of the additions you gave, or at least you wrote the very first appearance of Shriek in Maximum Carnage, because she shows in Spider-Man Unlimited. Why do you think she was an important addition to flesh out Carnage as a character?
Um, I I think she created a kind of humanity within him, um, and touched something within him that he hadn't experienced before. I think that this is the first time he cared about somebody, and his initial, if I remember correctly, and I probably don't because it's been a lot of years. Um, his initial reaction would have been to kill her.
Hmm.
And yet something about her touched something within him, which even he didn't quite understand.
Hmm. So I think one interesting thing about Shriek, as far as Cletus goes, is that her power is a fundamental weakness in Carnage because he's weak to anything that's like Sonic based.
Right.
So why is that? Why was it important for her to have a power that could weaken him to make that relationship function?
Whenever you're creating characters around the character, you want to have something that, you know, um, allows them to reflect some part of their personality or their powers back at them.
Hmm.
Um, and the fact that she reflected a weakness towards him, you know, she could make him weak. So obviously, his first reaction should have been to kill her.
Yeah.
Hey, this is a Sonic person. Wipe her out. And yet, no, I'm going to keep her around. I'm going to keep her around me. The one person who can kill me is the one person I'm going to keep around. You have to look at, you know, I, I once said to Mark Grunwald, all the characters around Peter Parker, reflect some part of Peter Parker.
Hmm.
And Mark, the brilliant guy, he says, "Oh, like a character wheel," and he created the term character wheel, which I, have co-opted, but I have to give Mark credit for it because he came up with it. Um, and it's basically that all the characters around that revolve around your main character, they all revolve around him and revolve around him or her, but for obvious reasons, and they all show us different aspects of that person's personality.
I think that's that was very interesting. Was again, that's how the dynamics you create around Carnage. That you kind of had a father, mother with Carnage and Shriek. You had the child doppelganger. Whose idea was it to make it almost as a family dynamic with when you started developing these characters?
Like I said, we were in a room full of creative people. I don't remember which one of us came up with that specific idea. I wish I did, but that came out of the discussions. You know, I apologize to Mark, Todd, Howard. It's a really good idea, so I probably didn't come up with it, but I don't know.
The cool thing about Maximum Carnage is that it actually it was so popular, it became a video game, which was a fun game. I used to play that game and I loved it a lot. And apparently, if you had the comic book that came with that video game, it's now worth hundreds of dollars. So unfortunately, I don't have that one anymore. But apparently, it was worth a lot of money. But
did an actual comic book come with the?
Yeah, it was this ultra thin. I think it was like a 10 or 12 page issue that was kind of a reprint of some of Spider-Man Unlimited, but with a different cover on it, and it came with the game. And if you had that issue still, it's worth hundreds of dollars apparently, like $200 or $300 right now.
Okay.
which I wish I had. I looked at my collection. I could have sworn I still had it, but apparently somehow I don't. and I kind of kick myself now about that one. But considering that that storyline is so popular that it did launch a video game, it's still talked about, it's still referenced. What does it feel like to know you created something that had that level of staying power?
Uh, quite honestly, I don't think about things like that. I am always more focused on the next story I'm doing than the ones I've already done. I mean, it's when you write a story, you hope that it will um, create an emotional response in your readers, and that it'll stay with them and haunt them and be with them for a long period of time. And when you find out years later that certain stories you've done created those responses, you're like, hey, cool. uh, I, um, I was editor in chief at Marvel for a bunch of years, and while I was there, I had to do a lot of traveling. I had to go to a lot of comic book conventions. And after I was done with that, I figured I don't have to go to comic book conventions anymore. So I stopped going. I stopped going for years. And Mark DeMattis at one point said to me, "Listen, you should get out there and you should go to conventions." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "You spend so much time working. You should go out there and see the effect your work has had on people."
Hmm.
And I thought, that's kind of, do I want to give up a weekend and to find out? And I started to go to conventions, and I'm so happy that I did, because I meet people who were affected by the stories I did, and it's very fulfilling. I don't get invited to many conventions because I'm I'm a hard guy to find. uh, you
Well,
know,
but I will say though, as someone who loves going to conventions, I have an autograph wall behind me and all over my wall. Literally, my entire house, every wall in my house is autograph walls from comic books and stuff like that. And I had Jim Matisse and Mark Bagley's autograph and things like that nature. And I'm telling you, I have actually have some of the issues of Carnage. Well, the original 361, 363 series, all autograph. I must say, I love getting those autographs, and I think it's great meeting our the writers that make the comic books that we love. So yeah, do those conventions. It makes your fans very happy. And if you ever make it to my side of the woods, which is Rhode Island or Connecticut, let me know.
well, if I get invited, I'll come if we can work out. You know, okay. Well, they have to pay for all sorts of stuff in order to get me to go.
Yep.
Um, I'm at this stage of the game. I sadly, I'm slowing down. I no longer. I used to work 7 days a week, at least 10 to 12 hours a day. Don't do that anymore. I actually take weekends off. Just watch the whole Super Bowl yesterday, and you know, I like I say, if a convention promoter can actually track me down, uh, it's mainly through Facebook, because I don't have a lot of social media.
Hmm.
I'm the kind of guy when I turn on a computer, I should be working, not wasting time with computer games or social media or that sort of stuff. I got to
well,
be working.
speaking of work, you did also work another famous storyline as well. So I'll do one more. Sort of, if you have the time, you worked on the Clone Saga, which became very famous as well. Created Ben Reilly, and what was that experience like working on that saga? How was it writing Ben Reilly, who's kind of like Peter Parker, but kind of not like Peter Parker, and you kind of have to like make sure they're distinct a little bit. What was that like?
You had to make sure he was distinctive a lot, that he was a real person,
Right, right.
because we always knew that ultimately, well, our original plan was, you know, Ben comes on the scene. We discover that Ben is the real guy and Peter is the clone. Um, Ben takes over. Peter goes to live happily ever after with Mary Jane. He's going to have a baby. Um, you know, at the end of Act 2, tragedy strikes Ben, and Peter has to come back. And then we find out, wait a minute, it was a fake. Peter actually is the real guy. Ben was the clone. You know, Stuart Trainer lied to us. And then, you know, Peter comes back. He saves Ben, and then Peter reassumes the Spider-Man identity. Ben goes off as the Scarlet Spider, and now we have 2 Spider-Man books. One with a married Peter Parker with a baby, one with a single Peter Parker, though we call him Ben Reilly, you know, going off on single adventures. Hey, we get the best of both worlds. That was the plan. Didn't quite end up that way, but that was the plan. I always like when the readers, you know, say, "Oh yeah," you know, they you know, the readers hated the idea that that Ben was the real guy, so Marvel changed it at the end. Yeah, that was always the plan, guys.
I think the interesting about the Clone Saga is that I feel like this story has become better received as time has gone on. And I mean, Ben Reilly become very popular character. There's been some Ben Scarlet Spider stories, whatnot. They revisited Kane and has been brought back and stuff like that. Well, I think the storyline has become more popular with time.
A lot of storylines happen that way. You know, when a storyline is happening, if we are doing it correctly, we have the readers, you know, we are playing with your readers' emotions. And we are going out of our way to upset the readers, because we are being very nasty to the characters and taking the characters through hell, and as a result, taking the readers through hell because they care about the characters. So while the storyline is happening, a lot of times the character is suffering and the readers are suffering. So they claim they hate the story because they're suffering with it. You know, when the story ends and, you know, everybody is happily ever after or whatever, the readers like catch their breath, and then the new storyline starts and they start suffering all over again. And then time goes on and they realize, you know, I really cared about the character then. That's when I really cared the most about it. That's when I was most in love with the character. And then nostalgia takes over and they go, well, you know, this was a great storyline. I remember I went to a comic book convention around the time the Clone Saga was happening. And I went to get my badge and I gave my name to the guy behind the booth. And he goes, Tom DeFalco, you're connected with the Clone Saga. He says, I love the Clone Saga. And the guy next to him says, really? I hate the Clone Saga. And the two of them started arguing about the Clone Saga. And within minutes, everybody behind the table, all the people who were supposed to be handing out badges, are arguing about the Clone Saga. And me, all I want to do is get my badge. So I finally get my badge and I turn around and I realize all the people behind me are now arguing about the Clone Saga. So as a writer, I think, hey, we must be doing something right because people, this is really striking chords. And that's what we try to do. You know, when I was on the Fantastic Four for a while, and people were saying, you're so mean to all the characters. You know, I hate what you're doing. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. And now these days, when I show up at a convention, they always say, that was the last time I cared about the Fantastic Four. I loved what you did because it really made me care about the characters and care about the Fantastic Four. Because that's what our job is, to make you, you know, that's what I always thought my job was, to make you care so much about the characters that you're suffering while they're suffering.
So when you were writing that storyline, which character was more fun to write, Peter Parker or Ben Reilly?
You know, they were both hard to write. You know, all of these characters are hard to write. and listen, if you're suffering, imagine me. I have to get into their heads. I'm suffering about what's happening to poor Peter, what's happening to Mary Jane, what's happening. I'm suffering too. None of this stuff is easy. That's why they call it work.
So having, once again, you've had this great career. Like I said, you read some of my favorite storylines of all time. What's next for you? Is there something else you're working on or will work on?
Well, in the world of comic books, I am often working on 5-page stories that appear in the Archie Digests and stuff like that. Matter of fact, tomorrow morning I'm getting up early and doing a Betty and Veronica story. And for Marvel recently, I did this a Secret Wars. It was called Marvel Superhero Secret Wars Battle World. It is a direct sequel to Secret Wars #1, and actually occurs between two panels of Secret Wars #12. And it's a 4-issue limited series. I think the first 3 are out now. I don't think the 4th one's out yet. Might be. And we find, there was a whole untold tale that we didn't even know about. And it involves a bunch of things that could have an effect on things today. It was an interesting assignment when the editor gave it to me. I said, Secret Wars, that must have been 30 years ago. He says, actually, it was 40 years ago. And my editor is not quite 40. He said it's in his early 30s. So I said, so you want me to do a sequel to a story that came out before you were born? And he said, yeah. And you got to figure out a way to make it relevant for today's readers. So now there's a challenge. There's a creative challenge. And I think we succeeded. We even introduced some new concepts and some new characters, which hopefully 40 years from now, somebody else will write a sequel to this one. It's not going to be my problem.
Well, hopefully you can come on and we'll talk about this series as well.
Thank you for inviting me to your podcast. I really appreciate it. And thank you to all the readers, because if you guys hadn't supported my work over the years, I would have had to get a real job.
Like I said, have a great night, sir.
You too.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Versus Stars podcast. Please help me better the algorithms by liking and subscribing. Be sure to return for the next episode when David Hewlett returns to the mothership. We discuss tech bandits, escape room classes, and more. So next voyage, travel on.